Welcome.
The Pathology Innovation Collaborative Community is a regulatory science initiative that aims to facilitate innovations in pathology, as well as advance safety and effectiveness evaluation. The PI Collaborative Community aims to harmonize approaches to speed delivery to patients through collaboration in the pre-competitive space. The PCCP is open to all stakeholders, public or private, including but not limited to academia, industry, healthcare providers, patients, and advocacy groups. Meetings of this kind are an example of lawful activity under federal antitrust law, because the focus of the meeting is on government action or policy, including the industry's responses or positions taken with respect thereto. However, antitrust monitoring is needed for companies' own protection, since they are direct competitors meeting together. These meetings need to stay within protected subject matters and need to be monitored so that they do not stray off into inappropriate areas, such as pricing and price terms, sales and service territories for particular products, customers and customer territories, each company's individual decisions regarding selection of suppliers or customers, marketing plans and especially future marketing plans or new product offerings, other proprietary or competitively sensitive information. Today's meeting will follow the written agenda, and there will be no discussion of pricing or other prohibited topics. If the discussion veers into those topics, we will terminate the discussion. If you have any questions or concerns about the propriety of a discussion, please raise it immediately, and we will take a break to determine how best to proceed. The Medical Device Innovation Consortium acts as the formal convener, and we will follow their conflict of interest policy. For additional information, we defer to our Code of Conduct and our website, www.pathologyinnovationcc.org. We look forward to moving the field forward.
Give it another minute for folks to appear. Since this is a working project, I can probably do a brief round of introductions for people. That's probably a few more people showing up. Who's here? See Catherine, hi, Vaughn, Lev, Mary, Brandon, Wemming, hello. I see Christopher here. Wonderful. Hey. Okay. So this was an extra minute. Let's go back to the main screen here. Let's do a quick round of introduction, because I think there might be people dropping in and out, but I think since this is one of the working meetings, it would be great to do a brief round of introduction. So I'm Joe Leonards, hosting the session today and working on this PCCP project with Ulla, and of course, everyone here on the call. Ulla, hand it off to you.
Great. Yep. I'm Ulla. I help with the organization of a lot of the PCC things, and I'm excited to learn from everyone here in the PCC project today. I guess I'll hand it off to someone as well. Mary, I see you.
Sure. I'm Mary Kennedy, Director of Clinical Informatics at the College of American Pathologists, and I'm here really to learn more about this.
Brandon?
I'm Brandon Gallus. I'm a researcher and reviewer in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health in the Division of Imaging, Diagnostics, and Software Reliability.
Perfect. Next on my screen is Kevin.
Hi, Kevin Schaap, CAP staff, working with Mary on our AI committee and various other things, and also here to learn more about this.
Perfect. Next is Vaughn Spurrier.
Hello, I'm also here to learn. My name is Vaughn. I'm the AI research team lead at a company called Proscia. We are a biotech startup in the digital pathology space based in Philadelphia. And yes, I'm here to learn.
Awesome. Then on my screen, I have Han Tran.
Han Tran. I'm
Oh,
also,
sorry.
no worries. I'm also CAP staff. I work with Mary and Kevin, and my position is Assistant Director of Federal Health IT Policy.
Awesome. Thank you, Han. Christopher Jackson.
Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Jackson. I'm currently a clinical informatics fellow at MGH. I'm really interested to learn about this as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Christopher, for joining. Then we have Catherine Latham.
Hi, everyone. I'm Catherine. I'm a first-year resident at MGH. Very interested in this space and hoping to get involved. Thanks for letting me join.
Perfect. Then Lev Lipkin. Lev.
I'm software development data scientist working for long.
Perfect. Then we have Wenming Xiao.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm a lead bioinformatics scientist at the Office of Oncological Disease Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. Happy to learn here.
Wonderful. Then we have Emre Gulturk.
Hello, everyone. Emre Gulturk. I'm the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at Page AI. So yeah, looking forward to the conversation. Thanks for including me.
Good seeing you again. And then there's Stacy Kearney.
Yes, hello everyone.
Hi.
I'm sorry, Joe, I missed the original part. I think I connected.
Stacy is a regulatory expert consultant with many skills. We just did a brief round of introduction. And then I see Sam Spencer.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I'm joining a little bit late and off camera, but yes, I am here. I'm the Senior Director for Standards and Guidelines at the CAP.
Wonderful. So I think briefly to explain, there's a guidance called PCCP in abbreviation. We get to that in a second. We put together a little bit of a website overview that should serve as a resource. This is where this meeting will go. Ola and I put a little slide deck together to briefly outline what this guidance does and what it's trying to portray, including a figure to illustrate a little bit of the structure of the guidance. Then we wanted to discuss with this group what some of the relevant components in this guidance are, because it's been long awaited and it's, I think, a very carefully designed guidance. We're currently still in the open comment period. And then the question is whether we want to take on a project, explore certain functions of this predetermined change control plan guidance. We may have a follow-up meeting and may derive some projects out of this. And of course, the question is, as always, what are, some of the pertinent questions? So as a brief overview, this is a mouthful. But what we call the PCCP project is referring to the predetermined change control plan. Now these 4 words in itself is basically the abstract regulatory terminology for what if a device software function evolves over time in a large oversimplification. We get to a more specific wording, but this is a very controversial topic because some of the key performance function may change over time. And then these are the marketing submission recommendations for AI or ML enabled devices. So briefly, the document was issued on April 3rd. All these slides will be available, but the underlying legislative basis for this was released last year as part of the Omnibus Bill Section 3308 in the Consolidated Appropriations Act. Now, the comment period is open until summer. I think it's usually 90 days or so. So we still have some time to consider if there's something worth commenting on. Now, if you haven't seen the document, we can share this. I don't know if Ulla has it right now, you can put it in the chat, but it is 43 pages. And there are multiple sections or divisions in the FDA that contributed to this, and you can see the link here. There's many folks involved, and it is probably because it will affect a discipline spanning set of tools here. Now, briefly, as a structure, the guidance is worth examining sort of what's the skeleton, what is the bones, i.e. what's the index. So aside from introduction and background and scope, I think the definition sections, which is part 4, is very important. There's 3 sections: software, data sets, and then the actual predetermined change control plan. So software with its functions, data, and the plan. Those are the 3 building blocks. Now there's a section called policy for PCCP, and that in itself has components, meaning the plan itself has components, how to establish it, how to identify, how to utilize it, and how to modify the plan. There's descriptions of modifications with 3 components, and a modification protocol, which is another multiple sections, and then one part that's somewhat unusual in the guidance document, which is impact assessment, and then different other components related to that. And there are also 2 appendices, which give some really practical examples. I believe that's very helpful for various device developers and how to think about this. Now, briefly, just to get to these definitions, the device software function, or ML enabled, which is then MLDSF. So again, a lot of acronyms here, but I think it's important to understand what this is of course, a device software function needs to be defined. And here are some examples. Could be personalized diagnostics, could be assistive functions. But the element that's, I believe, in here is that if they're machine learning enabled. Now, what machine learning enabled is, we get to in a second. And then one part that's mentioned in the introduction is the term validation. Now, validation never occurs in CLIA, but validation is a term that's used, I would say, in various ways. And I believe it's very important here to look at that validation, which in this guidance is mentioned as the confirmation by examination provision of objective evidence that a particular requirement or specific intended use can be consistently fulfilled. So that's a very broad definition, but there is actually a separate definition for validation later on. So that's why I wanted to point this out. I don't think we have to go through the background section. There are, I believe, over 9 different other guidances that are cross-referenced. We didn't complete the full network analysis, but I think it affects probably on the order of 17 different other guidances. So this is not a guidance that stands alone that you can read like, one element, but there's pre-certification, there are other public workshop documents that are cross-referenced quite a bit. And of course, even the AI Bill of Rights is quoted in this guidance. So it's a very broad document. There was a session, a video of that is available. That was the official sort of overview of this guidance document. It showed one of these slides. I think we have 1 or 2 other slides from that presentation, which gives the complete historic background. So in other words, if you want to just go by what's officially documented and cross-referenced, this is at least the work over the last 4 years trying to navigate this very arguably important topic into the realm of usable documents. And in terms of the 3 things, if you want to say like, hey, what should we read? It's these 3 documents. There's a discussion paper that outlines pre-specifications for software changes. There's an action plan, which is very patient centered and should include transparency, and then this guidance document. The scope, again, machine learning enabled device software functions entail 2 things that might modify over time. One is an automatic modification and one is a manual modification. I think those terms are fairly self-evident. So if the software automatically modifies the underlying model versus if those steps for modification require human input, that's within the scope of this guidance. There might be other device software functions that may have a combination of both, but I think that's for now the scope. There are 2 or 3 other things in the scope that are worth looking into. One element is that this information is to be included in the PCCP in a marketing submission. We get to that in a point in a second, but it is sort of an adjunct document that if your device contains ML-enabled device software function, it should be part of the marketing submission, and then a PCCP, i.e. the plan, has to be submitted. And it is also generally applicable to combination products, which is an important addition, because some of these devices, there may be drug device or biologic device, etc. So that's an important thing just in the scope section. Few others, but definitions. So I won't read these to you, but I wanted to point out 2 or 3 things. So in the software part, there is DSF distinguished from ML DSF. So take a look. These are just some of the highlights, but that's important because you may have a device with device software function and at the same time a machine learning enabled device software function, but not all of your DSF may entail ML DSF. That's an important thing. So in digital pathology, you may have a viewer that's a DSF and then have running a machine learning and enabled device software function in addition to the viewer. So you would have a combined DSF and ML DSF. That's just a simple example, but there are others. Data sets, and here we get to this word validation. So the interesting thing in this guidance, which I believe is a good vocabulary here, is that there is a definition of a training data set, which is to build the model, a tuning data set, which is an evaluation and exploration, which is kind of like assessment data set. And they mention specifically, do not use the word validation. And then there's a testing data set, which is an independent data set that provides data to establish a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. So I know that these terms are used in different realms with different meanings, but here it is basically the building, the evaluation or exploration, and a testing data set, which is then to use, for example, for performance assessment. There is, this is from the slide deck again, from the FDA presentation, a term mapping where, for example, the previous term software as a medical device pre-specifications, now in the current guidance would be called description of modifications, which is accurate. And you see there's a few more that have slightly changed. So impact change to impact assessment, and the algorithm change protocol is now a modification protocol. So there's probably a few other terms, but these are probably the most important ones. So in terms of the definition, and this is probably something that we should discuss because this is the actual concept, and this figure is constructed by us. So that's absolutely no guarantee that that's correct. But I think from a conceptual perspective, this might help. So in the definition sections, there's these 4 terms. So a PCCP plan, of course, is the last word here, then an authorized PCCP. That is, if it has been reviewed and authorized, that's the authorized PCCP, that's after FDA review. There's a modification protocol and impact assessment. So to make this a little more visual, what these individual documents or components of the PCCP are, we started here with, let's say, an initial developer. So you may have your machine learning enabled device software function that does something. And you have your data set that was used to establish that, and you have a performance assessment. So this could be an established tool. It could be your prototype, or it could be an actual reviewed device, or even an authorized device. Now, assuming that you now change that this machine learning enabled device software function would evolve, or you would change data, or you would use data over time to improve this machine learning function. So this is the part that inherits the power of machine learning and AI. This evolution, so to speak, will change, or will hopefully improve, but might change the performance. So what's needed is a method, and this is in parentheses a bit, this is the method on how you would change this. So what are you doing? Are you completely retraining the model, etc.? So you have to specify in a protocol what modifications you make. So that would be developing, validating, or describing your modifications. And then separate from that would be that you check whether the impact that this protocol or this method of change had is actually adequately capturing your performance improvement. So that is referred to as the documentation of the assessment of risks and benefits under that protocol. And both together would form the predetermined change control plan. That is what you have to submit to the regulatory authority to say what and how would you change this. And if this plan makes sense, then that would be, after appropriate review, be the authorized plan that you would execute by exercising this modification protocol and in combination with the impact assessment of whether your model truly under those modifications changed as intended. So I pause here because this is kind of the key element of in terms of like components in this guidance. Questions or suggestions here?
I'll take first question, I suppose. Is this meant to be you have to submit a new impact assessment with every time there is a model update, or this is a one-time for multiple downstream updates that could happen?
So we can go into that in a second. So there's no resubmission of, let's say, a 510K. So as long as you are within the limits here, it would not require a complete resubmission. But I can show you what that wording looks like. I think we get to that in a minute, but I don't know if I captured that correctly. I know we have some FDA folks on the call, but as far as I understand it, that would be within the realm of your predetermined change control. As long as your impact assessment shows that you achieved that change, you would not need to resubmit your entire device.
Brandon, you can comment.
Yeah, there's only one submission. I mean, there's not any subsequent submissions of this impact. So the impact assessment is forward thinking.
Okay.
Yeah, so on top of that, so let's say it's 510K, you don't need additional submission, but if it's like a PMA supplement, normally you will have an annual report, and so you will update your upgrades of that in the report.
The thing I want to ask, similar to Kevin's question, if we want to implement the same plan multiple times, I think this might even be just rephrasing Kevin's question. If we want to implement the same PCC plan multiple times, would we need a new submission within this framework? Let's say that the data set size doubles, I retrain, and then I go through this process, then the data set size doubles again later. Would I do a re-PCC plan submission?
As far as I understand it, no, as long as you keep the same modification protocol in effect. So the part that is really tricky, what you're asking is kind of a meta, it's like the next layer and then the next layer. So I think the art, if you want to call it that, of writing the modification protocol and the methods therein would need to harness what you just asked, meaning would it account for additional heterogeneity? So if your data set, for example, expands beyond the realm of limits of your features, how do you deal with that? And I think that is where I don't know what else to use other than art comes into play, but that's how I understood the guidance.
Makes sense. Thank you very much.
Joe, I have a question. What about data coming that might be changing over time, whether it's, some lab reactives or some other things, or even more variety in terms of conditions. So my question is, I would expect that periodic validation of the model makes sense, even if the model did not change, because data may be, getting into some area that was not taken into account when doing training.
Yeah, I think what you're asking is how to ensure that a growing, let's call it baseline, would still function appropriately. As far as I understand, these changes are, let's call it global changes, and they would not account for monitoring of the model during, let's call it after implementation. So the monitoring of the model performance under different data that are within the intended use, I do not think is purview of this PCCP guidance. But that's a very good question. I don't know whether that is part of the scope, but I didn't read it like that.
So another question, and perhaps it's kind of the same one, and I just didn't fully understand. If you have something that your model classifies, I'm just not a pathologist, so pardon the example that I use is, let's say it's a Gleason score of some sort, and the method by which the score is calculated or classified it changes due to some update in the literature or some new agreed upon standard. Does that mean that your existing model would not be like there's no way to make a change to that to accommodate? Well, you could probably change a model to accommodate that, but does that kind of exceed what this plan might be? Because your model suddenly has to classify entirely differently. Sorry.
I would say that would classify as a change of the intended use, because now you would change the entire classification. So if your model is built to, let's say, classify in 5 steps, and then the field says we change this now to 10 steps, I believe that would be beyond something that can be easily accounted for in a modification protocol. But that's a highly specific use case. So, but I would say it's similar to if you change the target population, or if you say, look, can we apply this to a different cancer? But that's more a question for the reviewers on the call here.
Yeah, and I agree with Joe's assessment. So if you change the model, or maybe you can consider as a different device, right? If you change your IU, a completely different device.
Okay.
So let me just go through a few more of the slides to get to some of the details. Yeah, go ahead.
So first of all, when Wei-Ming and I speak up, we're doing so in this collaborative space, and it's not representing the full agency opinion, and so very specific questions should come in to get a very specific agency response. So I've always worked with you and with this group in that kind of ground rules that I'm giving some opinions on some of the interpretations of the processes as best as we can, but especially when we start getting into specifics, that should come to in a submission, what we call at least in the Center for Devices, a Q-sub application. It's not an application, it's a Q-sub, which basically is a request to have a meeting, and that's where you can ask your questions and get official agency responses. One thing that I would say on this graphic here is the modification description. You have a protocol, but one of the key things that I know I look for is a real elucidation listing of what changes you're going to make. And that sets the stage for the protocol, how you're going to make it, and then the impact assessment, what impacts are expected. So I think when we have heard some of these questions, they have invited me as I haven't heard, whether or not these were addressed in the modifications scope or the description of the modifications, and especially like if the field changes to have a different scoring system, I'm not expecting that would have been in the modification description. So that's an important part that I think your figure here would benefit from.
So I think everyone here should be aware that you participate as scientists, and we're very thankful for you and Wei Ming and anyone from the FDA joining. And it is understood that that is not the official opinion, but it is sort of what we interpret as scientists on both sides of the
exactly. I just represented myself based on my previous experience working at CDIH. So any official comments should be coming from CDIH, current reviewer, or their divisions.
So quickly to your second comment, Brandon. So the individual components in a protocol we get to in a second, but after discussing it with Ulla and a few people, it is very complicated because we're talking about a changing software, a protocol that accounts for that, an impact assessment that accounts for what the protocol proposes, and that is the overall plan. And we just put this first before going into detail what each of these documents entails. Maybe that was wrong from an education perspective, but I think conceptually, these terms like, modification protocol and impact assessment, we thought presenting this first before going into the details what the guidance does. So quickly, the components. So there is a description of modifications, a modification protocol, and the impact assessment. So these three components were not portrayed on this schema, but I think as Brandon, you just mentioned it, the description of modifications is of course really important. So when establishing, these are the three pathways, so 510K, de novo, and pre-market approval are potentially appropriate. As you just mentioned, existing devices must submit the required documentation. So if there is an existing device that would now want to become machine learning device software function enabled, so this would be existing under these pathways and want to become MLDSF, then that would work. And of course, as you can see here, that's also directly from the guidance and what Brandon just mentioned, Q submission is encouraged. The identification or identifying a PCCP in a submission would be either as a standalone section. It should be prominently covered in the cover letter. There will be in the table of contents the actual plan, so the PCCP itself. And it is intended so that users are aware that device may require, let's say, software updates or other performance influencing modifications. It will need to be described in the summary, and that is all supporting transparency for that. I think that's fair. I think it just means that if a device has that, it should actually be made clear in all the common descriptions. There's a diagram in terms of utilizing a PCCP, which is what the modification would look like. So a device modification may be affected. And then the question is this following these rules? And if no, then you can submit a marketing submission for the modification. And if, following the review, you may actually just document that in your quality management system. But the idea or this element here is basically saying, is this appropriate for a PCCP, yes or no? That's I think any question related to that, I think depend highly on the specific use case. But I believe what this is trying to get at is PCCP the appropriate route for you and your specific element. And I think I would table the questions here for after you reviewed the appendix, because the appendix or the two appendices had that. Esther, good seeing you.
Yes, likewise. Actually, this is something that I think is very important, because when I was reading and reviewing the guidance, what I noticed is that at certain moments I was really wondering, like, oh, should we go back to a 510K and the traditional one, or maybe a special 510K or abbreviated 510K when we have a device modification? But I think it is clear that as soon as you include a PCCP in your initial submission and it gets approved, that you don't have to go back all the time to like, is this a traditional or abbreviated? However, as soon as you're deviating from the plan, you might have to go back. So I think that is important. But what I was wondering, and I don't know if you can comment on that, if anyone has seen it, what would be timelines with regards to that when you have to go back and do a Q sub? Is there any expedited review that you can do, because maybe that change that you're making does fulfill then a special 510K, those requirements, and then you might go faster using a special 510K route than going back, do a resubmission with a traditional 510K. So is that allowed, and is that, because that's something that is not fully clear to me. I think it is, but I don't want to make assumptions.
So as far as I read this, if you make your modification plan robust enough where you could say that the learning or the evolution of the machine learning enabled device software function would improve under what you anticipate will be, let's say, the growth of the data set and the modifications that you can anticipate, that would be the sufficient axis here horizontal, so you document it and you be good.
Yeah.
But what you're describing would be if things change, akin to what Kevin said earlier, or if you change fundamental elements, and that I would say defaults back to all the other guidance documents, and that is a much larger question. Now, what I wasn't so sure about is who monitors that and who governs that. And I would say that's typically done between the user and the developer. But like if you ask who will use this, I would say this is more the concept that you need to take into account when you design your PCCP, rather than as a user to identify whether there's a timeline for submission. So, but that I let others comment how they understood this graph or this approach of utilizing a PCCP.
Yeah, and maybe quickly to add to that, I fully aligned with you, and that's also how I reviewed it and see it. But it's more like, yeah, if there is a small deviation that you could not foresee, and usually you would then go internally, maybe like with a quick special 510K, and now it's actually saying you have to go back through a pre-market notification and come up with a new PCCP and those kind of things. So I think all doable, but I'm just wondering about timelines and are there shortcuts?
Not. So this is the section addressing this, but keep in mind, so this gets very confusing. The PCCP is a modification plan. Now we're modifying the modification plan. So this is changing the change plan, right? So we're now one layer deeper into the matrix. So I believe that is totally dependent on what device functions you're affecting. So if you say now we also account for, let's say, another discrete feature versus now we're taking completely different data sets. Of course, I believe that modifying the PCCP depends on the scale of your modifications.
Yeah.
But this is, I think this is the most meta level we can get, because modifying a modification plan gets very tricky, and it depends on the scope or scale of that modification.
Yeah, maybe let's not then dive into the details, but that's just what I noticed, but I think it is Like it is a well set up guidance. So I really appreciate it.
in the description of the modifications, and that may help, there are currently 3 big types. One is related to quantitative measures. So you would potentially say we measure this differently, or we change or take a different measure. Then there is a modification related to the device inputs. So that could be, you know, image sources, data, etc. And then there is this term limited modifications related to the device's use and performance. So there's an example given for use within a specific subpopulation. I believe that might be related to that you can apply a certain algorithm in, let's say, a certain subset of patients or in certain specific settings. And then if the function, let's say, for an ECG reading device suddenly becomes better in a subset of a certain arrhythmia, that might actually be evolving under a change protocol, but not if you change a completely different scope. So these are the current types that were mentioned. So quantitative, input related, or the specific subpopulation or target population. And if you read this last sentence here, there is, of course, the intention to take into account a benefit risk profile. So if a certain specific modification after a while becomes clear that that is robust enough, that might change. But these are currently the 3 types, which I believe is a great framework to go by. I'm not sure if people have comments on whether any type of modification is missing or is unclear, but
I would be thinking that the second one there would also just be adding more data. Because I think that is something most developers want to do, is always get their hands on more data to retrain their model. So that's kind of not represented explicitly here, but I'm pretty sure that's a case, a description, a modification description.
But adding more data should be already defined in the PCCP, right? So the protocol, how you including new data when we have a new version of the data set, training set, testing set, right? Validation set. This should be defined in the protocol already.
Yep.
And should not be considered as change of PCCP.
Oh, we're not talking about changing the PCCP right now.
No.
Okay.
We're just talking about the protocol itself, right? Or the full package itself.
Correct. This is a new section. This is
okay. Yeah.
I know the last slide was that because I think it matched Esther's question. And sort of, is it within or without the realm of a PCCP? But this is just the range of FDA authorized specifications under a PCCP. This is not changing the PCCP.
Okay, got it. Sorry.
So quickly, the modification protocol. So this is the document that specifies what you can. So the goal is, of course, to identify the method to ensure that the information will be generated by the manufacturer, risk and traceability. So these 4 points. So what are your data management practices? What is your retraining practice? What's your performance evaluation protocol? So this gets very close to the impact assessment. We get to that in a second. And then what are the update procedures? So how do you communicate that? How do you make it transparent to your users that you now have, you know, other elements or other performance components there? So quickly, slightly different portrayal is, again, from the FDA data set, or the deck, is the data management, your retraining and management, your performance evaluation, and your update procedures. So just a different portrayal with the various components, for example, how to communicate that, what are your statistical analysis plans? So if you look at this, these bullet points kind of outline what your modification protocol should touch on. So it is not just, yeah, we're going to use more data, and if the performance improves, we're going to do, we accept it, and otherwise we reject it. You will have to specify these points to enable a very transparent view of what your modifications would look like. So to briefly go through this, so data management practices, and I believe a common theme here would be this: what they are recommended, and what manufacturers should include in the submission. So these same kind of directive statements are there. You see a lot of these points that we can go through, but just to illustrate, so data management practices, retraining, again, what they are, why they're recommended, and what manufacturers should do. So, for example, for retraining, how do you sequester data, etc. So these things are fairly technical, and I believe a great framework to go by. I believe under the performance evaluation protocol, so what are your performance evaluations? There is an assessment needed for each individual modification and an in aggregate assessment for all implemented modifications. And I believe that is very important. So think you use different data input, but you also use a different quantitative measure. I believe the performance evaluation as specified in the guidance would say you use the one modification with this different data, and the other modification is different quantitative measures. So you have to specify that for each individual modification, and then the aggregate, because there are some super effects that those different changes might influence each other. And what manufacturers should include in the submission, again, is mentioned in Appendix A. Now, the last part here is the update procedures. So how are the risks mitigated? How do you communicate this to users? I believe this is fairly similar to 510K updates, etc. So this is just to make sure that you're transparent, that all stakeholders are kept up to date, etc. So this, I believe, follows existing other paradigms. And then the modification protocol can have, for traceability purposes, something like, different methods that, as far as I can tell, could be potentially sort of follow a rinse and repeat fraction. So if you say modification 1 is this and modification 2 is this, it might actually follow the same method as indicated here. So it might be that you have the same data management practices for different modifications, but then, for example, the retraining practices might differ. But then the update procedures to notify people may all be the same. So if you look at these letters, what's implied here is you can synergize if your, let's say, practices or procedures are synergistic, then you don't need to specify that for every single element new, which I think is a great way of portraying this, because it's much harder to say than to get from this diagram. The second main component of the PCCP guidance is the impact assessment. So that is the documentation in a marketing submission that will discuss how individual and aggregate modifications included in the PCCP will be linked to those software functions and how you assess that. So I think this is a perfect summary. This is again from the FDA slide deck. So you have to compare the versions, you have to discuss the benefits, you have to then have the modification protocol as a reasonable and effective strategy for risk-benefit assessment. Then you have to discuss how the implementation actually is conducted and how that affects all other modifications if there are multiple. So this is a bit complicated, but if you look at sort of the appendix or the elements, I believe that is very helpful. So we can go through this again, but the part on the impact assessment, let me just jump back to the initial slide here. So the part that I believe is very critical to this is that the modification protocol with its individual components and the impact assessment with those elements that are affected by the protocol together form the articulated plan of what you intend to change in your machine learning enabled device software function. So that was the very quick overview. And with that, I definitely want to open it up for questions to the group. I see several other people joined the call, so welcome. If you haven't had a chance to discuss or make a comment, please, Vaughn.
Yes, so on that last point that you just made about needing the impact assessment to be a part of the PCCP, does that mean that it is intended to perform the impact assessment before the PCCP has been reviewed? Or do we get the plan reviewed and then implement the plan to get the impact?
I believe the latter. So I believe the impact assessment specifies how you're planning to use these modifications to assess the overall functionality of the device. So let's say before we would execute the modification plan, we plan to do this statistical analysis. We would ensure, that the following function is still there, that, I believe, for example, the device hardware may change or, things like that. Now, that impact assessment would reside with the product owner, not the agency, right? So you would then have to follow not only the pre-specified modifications, but also the pre-specified impact assessment without having to go through a resubmission. So it is more of a plan than a concrete thing, but I believe I would envision that you specify exactly how you assess that with statistical instruments, performance measures, etc.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
Not sure what other people thought when reading this, but.
And then is there any mechanism for, I guess, evaluating whether those impacts have been detrimental or have been like once we actually perform the impact measurement after we have the approved plan, is there any review of that, of the actual outcome of those stats analyses and all those things?
No, there's not, as far as I understand. I believe the idea is you will have to convince the agency that if you change one element, that you have put in place an impact assessment that governs that change appropriately based on your submission and idea of what the device function is. If you have another modification, how do you govern that? And both together, how do you govern that both changes won't totally destroy this? And how do you assess that your, let's call it in-house is wrong, but let's say manufacturer-based modification will not completely disrupt the entire function of the device, but how do you ensure with appropriate plans and assessments that the agency trusts you that you did this right? And this might not be the official wording, but I think it's something along those lines. So you're giving them a chance to review how you manage your own self-imposed anticipated modifications. I don't know, Brandon, if that jives with.
I will have to reread the guidance because I did not see it as an assessment plan. I thought it was an impact assessment at this moment, and that is provided with the full submission. What do we think are the impacts? What are the different components that get affected with each of these changes? And we believe that these issues are either small or mitigated through some processes, but I did not understand it to be a plan for impact assessment. I was under the belief that it was the impact of the hypothetical impact of the changes. So I will have to reread that, but that's an interesting read of the document. I think both are good strategies, and certainly doing more of that impact is good practice for whoever's in charge of the algorithm to verify and monitor and track over time. But I think we should all reread that part a little bit closer.
And Joe, this is Stacy. So I don't want to overstate, but as I was reading, I was sort of thinking it as in our typical software development processes, we're going to have risk assessments that have to be done with a new release version of the software. And so I read the impact assessment almost like one of those risk assessments you have to go through for any changes to the software, where you would go through that whole process. And it would be, you have release 1, then release 1.1 or 2.0, whatever the change actually requires in your release. So again, don't want to overstate it, don't want to make any assumptions, but if I was sort of thinking about it and trying to put it into my own processes, I would probably think about it under that system in my software development process. But it probably look a little different. Go ahead.
I think, for example, what you just said, right? The versioning, that is already a risk mitigation strategy. I mean, that sounds simple and everyone would probably do it, but specifying that is probably part of it, not of the impact assessment, but part of the documentation, etc. So for example, I thought the data sequestration is extremely important, right? If you have a different data input and you have, let's say, your legacy data set and your updated data set, you sequester them and you say now combined data performs better than sequestered data and legacy data. That sounds great. But now what if you modify something else? Is the modification primarily improving because of the new sequestered data or because of the legacy data or because of both combined? I believe that part is something that requires very careful versioning to really understand how you're modifying that. That permutates very quickly. So I agree, and I definitely also want to reread this again. But that's a very good point. What the impact assessment looks like, but I guess that would depend on the modification. I believe the simplest modification is probably use additional data in the same realm with the same features without modifying anything. And I believe that probably or hopefully one of the first submissions under this new guidance would account for that. But Wenming.
Yeah, I would like to share my experience working at the DMGP as a software reviewer. So we review some PMA 510K software medications, and also talking about risk assessment and the protocol. Normally, if we will actually link the protocol. Let's say we based on your changing of risk level, right? So you have level 1, level 2, level 3. You have high risk and no risk. So the protocol should define the process for each risk level for validation. How do you verify it, right? So I believe that you do need to have risk assessment first, and then understand how much change the impact gonna be for the device, and then you can follow in that risk level, and based on what protocol you defined, and you do the validation.
It's a very good point. I didn't think about the risk layers, because that's another layer superimposed.
Yeah. For example, if you have, like, say, very minor change, like say upgrade Python library, it do not touch your model at all, right? So that's considered as no risk or very minimal risk. So your protocol should be a very simple protocol for validation, right? But if you want to change, say, I change the model algorithms, that's significant changing. So that's a high level risk. And how do you verify it? How do you implement it? How do you validate? So that is totally different protocol, right? So I believe PCCP should have this different protocol and matching your risk assessment for the change.
Incredibly insightful. I think the software updates are of course on everyone's mind, right? And you know, it's even a different operating system sometimes messes things up. So that might be another element there.
Yeah, like for example, if you changing from the local HPC to cloud-based, that also have potential risk there, right?
Other questions or comments from the group? I know we're almost at the top of the hour, but I definitely wanted to also offer a separate session to ask more concrete questions or discuss certain use cases, potentially AI tools in digital pathology, but open to anything. We can also discuss, you know, next-gen sequencing or combination tools, right? When you would combine two methods with one or into one device. Yeah, and of course, any project. Christopher.
Hi, everybody. So especially in context of pathology, whenever we deploy a new laboratory test, we always have to validate it in the lab, right? And if there's a significant modification, then it often gets revalidated, right? I guess from CLIA rules. So if we make a new version of these models, presumably they'll have to be revalidated for the most part, if it's applicable. So I guess kind of the one thing I didn't see wrapped into the PowerPoint is from the point of view of the lab or the clinical setting that this is being implemented. So let's say if they have to revalidate it, what if it has worse performance? You know, version 2 has worse performance than version 1. Does that mean that they don't transition, that they keep version 1? Or is this just something that's going to be specified in the actual PCCP?
So you're talking about the clinical implementation, so the destination lab of the device. So I think that would fall into the realm of the practice of medicine. So generally speaking, then CLIA would apply. Now, I think one of the elements that's so tricky for this FDA guidance is that element is unclear yet. So I would assume under CLIA, you have to verify the performance. Now, if you verify that in your specific laboratory, although the manufacturer very transparently and PCCP compliant communicates in the best way, shape, or form possible to them, look, our model 2.0 is better, and then you run it in your lab and you identify that it's worse than your version 1.0, you could still reject or not accept that version. The question is, of course, backwards compatibility, etc. That actually happens quite a bit on the CP side when, you know, new versions of tests or if other tests are discontinued. But I believe that's outside of the scope of this particular guidance.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
Okay, so I think we will end here. The video and the documentation, including the PowerPoint, will be shared with everyone. And we will send you an email to all the participants and, of course, the whole community about the next date, when we will try to probably go through a couple of use cases just to illustrate what that might look like. Thank you very much. This was great discussion, and thanks a lot.